Good morning. This video, we are going to see about the requirements engineering process. So when I say requirements engineering, it is nothing but the process of identifying, analyzing, and documenting the services and constraints that is required in the software development. So you all know the meaning of the requirements. Requirements means the needs. So when it comes to software development, needs are nothing but the features what we expect from the system. So which means that the features which we are going to develop in the system. Okay. So when it comes to requirements engineering, it includes the task and the techniques used for understanding the basic requirements of the system. So here we have four steps involved in requirements engineering. The first one is feasibility study. Second one is requirements elicitation and analysis. Third one is requirements specification. And the last one is requirements validation. So when I say feasibility study, like we are going to assess whether the system is useful or not, whether we wanted to take up the system or not. And the second stage is we have to find out what is the requirements. And the third step is we have to convert whatever requirements we have gathered in the second stage into a standard format. Say, for example, IEEE format for documentation and all. We have to convert whatever findings we have done in the stage 2 into a standard documentation so that it can be referred in future. And the last step is we are going to validate whether we have identified all the requirements which is needed for developing this system. So this is the four steps involved in requirements engineering. So the first step, as I told you, it is feasibility study. So before taking up the project, we have to find out whether we can implement the system with whatever technology we have or whatever resources we have, and whether we can complete the project on time, or whether we can uh, finish the project with whatever skill set we are having, and maybe whether the business is profitable at the end. So these are all the dimensions with which we will perform the feasibility study. So for this feasibility study, we collect the information by questionnaires. Here are some sample questions from which we can collect the information. And generally, the feasibility study should be completed within 2 to 3 weeks. And after collecting the information, it has to be reported. Maybe you have to document it, and which is usually referred as the feasibility report. The second stage is requirements elicitation and analysis. So here, this is the main stage where we are going to identify what are all the features we want to develop in the system. So when I say we are going to identify the requirements, we have to collect the requirements from all the different stakeholders. Stakeholders or the person who may be directly involved in the system or maybe indirectly involved in the system or benefited by the system. So you have to collect the requirements from all the different stakeholders. And one drawback here is when I say I'm collecting the requirements from the stakeholders, sometimes they may not be knowing well in advance that what feature they actually need. And sometimes they may express the requirements in their own terms, which may lead to a conflict. So when it comes to requirements elicitation and analysis, there are four steps involved in requirements elicitation and analysis. The first step is requirements discovery. Second one is classification and organization. Third one is prioritization and negotiation. And finally, documentation. So we will see what is the process involved in requirements discovery first, followed by the remaining steps. So when I say requirements discovery, it involves gathering the information from the existing as well as the proposed system. And here we collect the information from the stakeholders through either interviews or maybe through some observational techniques or maybe through scenarios. So here is an example, like when we take a bank ATM system, who are all the stakeholders involved, and from all these stakeholders, we are supposed to collect the requirements. And when we are collecting the requirements, we have to consider the perspective of the different stakeholders. So each and every person will view the system in their own perception. So the interactor may have their own viewpoint, their own expectation from the system. Maybe the indirect stakeholders will have a different expectation, and the domain viewpoints will be different. So we have to collect the requirements from all these three viewpoints: interactor, indirect, and domain viewpoint. So when I say collecting the requirements, I can use interviews. And interview means you are going to communicate with the stakeholders, maybe in the form of a closed interview or an open interview. When I say closed interview, you will be having a predefined set of questions. By collecting the answers to these questions, you can get the information about what is the major requirements. And the other one is open interview, where you will not be having any predefined agenda. You are free to discuss about what is the feature you are expecting. Next is scenarios. Scenarios are nothing but the real life examples from which we can collect what is the requirements for the existing system. So UML use case diagram is one of the example for a scenario based techniques. So here in the format, in a diagrammatic format, we identify what is the feature required to be developed in the system, who are the actors involved in the system, and what type of interaction will be there in between the actor and the system. So this is a sample use case diagram. You can see the actors involved in an ATM system. There will be a technician who is taking care of maintenance and repair, and the customer can maybe check the balance, deposit amount, withdraw amount, or transfer funds with the bank. So this diagram will tell you what all the features you have to develop in the system. And this is when you are saying a scenario as a it should have a starting situation, what should be the flow of the event, maybe sequence or maybe parallel or something like that. And you should also include what are all the possibilities where you can get some errors, and if so, how can it be handled, and is there any concurrent activities to be taken, and what is the state at the completion. So this is a sample sequence diagram, and next is ethnography. So ethnography, it is an observational technique. Like you can visit the work environment, and you can try to find out what type of work is being done, and is there any requirements from the working environment. So you can just interact with the people, and you can find out what is the real requirement. So these are all the different ways by which you can discover the requirements. And after discovering the requirements, you go for documenting the requirements. Okay. So this topic is software requirements documentation. So after collecting the requirements from the user, you go for documenting the requirements, because which can be referred by the team in future. So when I say SRS, it is an official statement of what the system developer should implement. So an SRS should include both the user requirement and the detailed specification of the system requirements as well. When I say SRS, always a document will be referred by different stakeholders. These are all the stakeholders who will be using the SRS document for their own purpose. When I say customers, the customers will be using the SRS to specify what requirements they need from the system, and maybe they will check whether the requirements have been met or not. And next is when I say managers, they will be using the SRS to plan accordingly what has to be done, and when the development has to be started, all those things. And when I say system engineers, they use the requirements document to understand what has to be developed in the system. And the test engineers can also use this SRS. They use the SRS to develop validation tests for the system. And maintenance engineers can use this SRS to understand the system and what type of relationship exists between the different modules. So when I say documentation, this is the template for SRS. So this is a standard IEEE template based on which we have to document the findings. So the first thing is you have to give an introduction. Introduction composed of five subdivisions. Like first one is the purpose of SRS, why we need SRS. And second one is the scope of the product. When I say scope, what are all the features we are going to develop in the product? When I say ATM, the features like you can go for pin change, then you can go for deposit, you can go for withdraw, you can go for mini statement. So these are all some of the features provided by the ATM system. Then if you have any acronyms like what is the acronym for ATM, and if you have any definitions, you can explain. And if you have any references, if you have referred to any other past projects, you can include here. And finally, the overview of the remaining part of the document. And the second section is the general description. So here we will be explaining the product perspective, what are all the functions you have, what about the user characteristics, and is there any other general constraints, and finally assumptions and dependencies. And the third section is you have to explain the functional and non-functional and the interface requirements as well. So this is specific requirements about the project. And in this case, for a better understanding, you can include the use case diagram or a data flow diagram, which will tell you what type of information flow is there among the different processes. And finally, appendix and index. So this is how we have to document whatever findings we have done for the particular project. And after finding, the last stage is requirements validation. So I hope you know the meaning of validation. You're going to check whether we have actually identified all the requirements which we definitely need for developing the final system. So this is what the last stage of requirements engineering. So when I say validation, I'm going to perform 5 different types of checks. First one is validity checks. So this is like to check whether the system provides all the functions which best supports the needs of the customer. Then second one is consistency check. So here we are going to check whether there is any conflict among the requirements. Then third one is completeness check. Here we will be checking whether all the functions required by the customer has been included in the system or not. And next one is the realism check. Here we will check whether the requirements can be implemented within the available budget and technology. And finally, we will perform verifiability. That is, we will check whether the requirements can have any mechanism for verifying. And when it comes to requirements validation, there are 3 different techniques which can be followed for validating the requirements. One is from the requirements reviews. You can find out whether we have identified all the requirements or not. And next is from prototype, that is the basic working model from which we can find out whether we can implement the final system or not. And the last one is through the test cases, we can find out whether we can implement the entire system with whatever requirements we have identified or not. Okay. So this is the 4 steps involved in requirements engineering process. Starts from the feasibility study. We identify the requirements, what is the functional and non-functional requirements, and then we go for documentation, and then finally we go for validation. So this is regarding requirements engineering process. And after this, you go for you go for classifying what all the requirements you have, and after classifying you can group the requirements according to maybe the similarity or something like that. And finally you can go for prioritization and negotiation as well, and then you can go for documentation.